to the Kent Lapp Podcast.
Travis Brown, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. I think you've got an interesting view on quite a lot of things. First of all, just because it's fresh on mind because we watched the movie last night, have you seen the movie Just Mercy?
We also watched it last night.
Really?
Really, my wife saw that it was streaming for free.
Yes.
And so we decided to check it out.
Oh, man. Did you watch it with the kids or just you and your wife?
Me and my wife and father-in-law.
Ah, what'd you think of it?
So I'd read the book, or I think listened to an audio book, so I knew a little bit about the story.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, it's moving. And my comment to my father-in-law after we watched it is that Bryan Stevenson is a hero.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, he really is. His part was played very well, too, by Michael B. Jordan. I mean, he's just so great. Jamie Foxx is in there. It was gripping. It's the type of movie where I thought about it the next day. Like, anytime you think about a movie, like a lot of movies, you know, watch and it's great, but the next day or the day after, you kind of forget about it. But some movies, like, you think about it the next day. I was thinking about that movie a lot today.
You know, what struck me about that movie in watching the different legal proceedings is that, you know, the conviction of, you know, the main character played by Jamie Foxx, it had the veneer of legitimacy, but it was actually just a fraud. That they technically met the requirements of whatever the law was, right? They had a witness, an eyewitness that put the man at the scene, and they had a corroborating witness, which is what the law said you had to have for first-degree murder, but the whole thing was just created, and you saw that play out.
Well, who was the corroborating witness in that story?
The corroborating witness was the man who was let off of a charge by saying he saw the truck drive away.
Okay, so they don't have to have two witnesses. They just need one.
And again, this is Alabama criminal law from the 1980s, so I'm not, you know, but that's my understanding of what was said in the movie by the Bryan Stevenson character is that under Alabama law, that's what they had to prove.
So when you said corroborating witness, it's not like we have a witness, then we have another one to kind of corroborate with that story. We just need a witness. Yeah, because that's obvious who it was in the movie. It was that guy, like you said, that got some charges dropped.
Right, and so you remember the main witness, the star witness, so to speak, the man who had been burned as a child, who then they placed in the room next to where the chair was in the state prison. He essentially came up with his storyline after they did that to him, and then they found this other corroborating witness who made up that, oh yeah, I saw his truck at the cleaners.
Yes, that's right. Okay. Yeah, for those that don't know what we're talking about, it's the movie's just called Just Mercy. It's streaming free on Amazon for the month of June because of everything that's going on right now. That's what tipped me over the edge to watch it.
It's also on Apple TV. That's where we watched it. So
Okay, gotcha. Well, we watched it on Apple TV too. We just went to the Amazon app. Where did you go? Just on the Apple TV
app,
Oh, it's free there too? Oh, wow. Oh, that's really great. But yeah, it's based on Bryan Stevenson, this phenomenal lawyer who went through Harvard, comes out, and then there's this conviction of Walter McMillan in 1987, African-American man who it appeared in the movie he's like a logger or a tree farmer or something, and they pin him for murder of this 18-year-old white girl.
Right.
What's so crazy about this is he had like 20 people wasn't it 20? It was a crazy amount of people. 12. Okay. 12 family members that were with him, saw him, and could testify that there's not a possible way for this guy to have killed that girl because I was with him all morning.
And even crazier, he, I think with his son, had taken the transmission out of his truck for repair, so he couldn't have even been driving his truck because it was up on the rack.
Oh, man, I missed that detail. I remember something about a transmission and in the garage, but I didn't piece that together that the truck that this witness said he was driving was on a rack with the tranny out of the truck.
It just shows that at that time, and we can talk more about whether and how much things have changed, but it speaks to the fact that the only witnesses that really had any credibility were white witnesses.
Yes. Well, absolutely. And then the only witness they had in the story, or in the plot there, they have a tape of him saying that he doesn't know anything about this. That guy's innocent, and they buried that tape in order to get a conviction. Furthermore, like you mentioned, that guy that was a witness, when he was 7 or so, he got burnt on his face, and like it messed up his mouth a little bit. You can see it in the movie. And to get him to testify against Walter McMillan, they put him, as I understand, at the end of death row, right by the electric chair, so that when someone would get executed, the smell of that burnt skin would draft up to him, and he would smell it and basically make him crazy, because he almost got burned in a fire as a kid, and now every time someone's executed, he has to deal with that smell, and that's what kind of broke then. He said,
Right.
I'll say whatever you need me to say. I need out of here.
And the next day, he was moved back to the county prison.
Oh, man. But, man, I'll tell you what, though. That scene, it's the kids, that's the one scene where the kids left the room. But it wound up being longer than I thought. It's, I don't know, 5 to 10 minute scene leading up to this this guy that was in the Vietnam vet.
Right.
Herbert, African American Vietnam vet. And you can tell this guy is messed up, like in his head. The war messed him up. And apparently he had, I don't know if that part is true or not, because it's all based on a true story. I just don't know. Is Herbert was that a real
I don't remember
character?
from the book, but
so he was messed up from the war, and at some point he put a bomb on someone's porch, and someone accidentally died. But he was put on death row for that. And the scene leading up to his execution, man, I feel like that's the most vivid. I felt like I was in it. Like I felt like I was in the movie. I mean, the angst, the anguish, his brothers around him in cells right next to him, knowing that he's coming out now to die. It's his turn, and walking down past the other cellmates, saying bye for the last time. You can just see the anguish on his face. And then as they get into the room where the chair is and everything, he just sort of collapses, and they help him into the chair and strap him down. Thankfully they don't show the actual when they turn the electric on, but it's just so striking and vivid. Like it felt like I was in the room watching this guy for real. Like they did an exceptional job in that movie of bringing you into the whole plot, into the story.
And I think in many ways that moment is what, to the extent it's based on the part of the true story, and I have no reason to think it's not, is that it seems in the movie that death of Herbert is what launches Bryan Stevenson to go back and double down
Yes, it was
on the other case.
Yes, it absolutely was, because he was sitting in the room. Apparently, some people, I don't know who gets to sit in that room and watch it, but you can watch the actual execution. He was one of them, and obviously it had an effect on him. And yes, it did cause him to double down. And that was from 1987, and then some of the movie gets into like the early 90s. Is that still a thing? Do we still execute people in this country?
Yes.
All states, or some states, or is this state specific? Or
no? So the federal government still does, and a handful of states still do. A lot of states have outlawed the death penalty, either by constitutional amendment, or their state Supreme Court has held that it constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. But a lot of states, including Tennessee, including Texas, a few other states still operate using the death penalty. In recent years, Texas has been the most prolific with its use. California actually still has the death penalty, but it's not been used in many years, and there's been a lot of efforts in California to repeal that.
Really? What would generally prompt a death penalty sentence? Because it seemed like this was one thing that really surprised me in the movie. It seemed common back then. Like, it seemed very common. I mean, Walter McMillan was in there because he was tagged for a murder, which obviously he didn't do. But this other guy, Herbert, there was, I guess, a death involved there, even though the bomb was not supposed to kill anyone. it just seemed common, I guess, in the movie. That's what stuck out to me was, man, it seemed like a common thing that they were executing people. What constitutes the death penalty generally?
You mean what types of offenses
I
would lead to
guess,
the death
yeah.
penalty? You know, I'm not
isn't it
I'm
that
not
clear?
a criminal law expert, but
Okay.
what I would, the typical things that come to mind are first degree murder. Some states, I'm not sure if it's still in effect, but first degree rape would also qualify.
Okay.
But yeah, it's typically first degree murder is the most common. What's interesting in this story about Brian Stevenson, and actually up until recently, I think there were a handful of states that still operated this way. But in every state that has the death penalty, the only entity that can impose the death penalty is a jury. In the state of Alabama at the time, if a jury imposed a life sentence for a capital case, the judge could override the jury and impose the death penalty, which is what the judge in Just Mercy did, the original judge in that death penalty case. And
he overrode the jury.
Right. So this is not in existence anymore, but for a very long time, many states had an effect that a judge could, in essence, overrule the jury's sentence and say, actually, no, this needs to be a death sentence instead of life imprisonment. And so now typically the judge acts as an advisor to the jury, and the jury makes that determination. At least that's my understanding. But
interesting. Another thing a scene that stood out to me from that movie was when Brian Stevenson was living in Delaware, I think it was, and he graduated Harvard Law. He could have basically have taken any job, but he moved to Alabama to start this equal justice. What's it called? Equal Justice Initiative, and so he gets to Alabama and he's new to town. He's driving down the road and he sees the prison labor, like these prisoners out in the field. I think some of them were crossing the road and they were all working, and there was cops with shotguns and guns and horses and everything. But there was, I don't know, it looked to me like 20 or 30 prisoners doing work in the field. And I think they were all, but maybe one, they were all black. And you could just see the look as he was driving by. You could just see like the question in his eyes. Like he was starting to piece it together. Prisoners, all black. That doesn't sound quite right.
Yeah, I think it was a little reminiscent. And it almost seemed like not much had changed.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. You because of the nature of your role at the Attorney General's office, we need to have some sort of disclaimer here, right? Because you're an attorney and you're at the AG's office, so sure, this is not legal advice, right?
Right.
What do we need to say here?
Let me give the disclaimer. So anything that I'm saying should not be taken as the position of the state of Tennessee or the state of Tennessee Attorney General's office. I'm not giving any legal advice. If anyone needs legal advice, they should talk to a lawyer. This should not be a substitute. This is just a conversation between friends. So I'm not being paid for this. I'm not representing my office. So I just want to get that out in front.
Good. Okay, good. All right.
And also, I can't talk about any cases in which the Attorney General's office is involved.
Yeah.
So, nothing
That's
like
not
that.
A surprise. Although I bet it would be some pretty fascinating I bet you'd get some pretty fascinating stories through the years. I'd love to. What are your thoughts on everything that's going on? I like to get into government too, but just watching that movie with so much already going on that's so racially charged, it's very chaotic, tumultuous time.
I'm a white guy from the South, from the southernmost part of Alabama, and the overwhelming thought I have right now is that I really don't have that much to say. I have a lot to learn, and I've prayed for a long time for the Lord to expose the biases that I know are in my heart. And so this is another opportunity for me to do that. I don't pretend to have any solutions because I've been the privileged person in this equation. And there's things that happen in my day-to-day life that expose those biases, and I'm working through those. I think that the one thing I would say to all of my white friends is you probably don't have all the answers that you think you have about this situation. So that's my overwhelming thought.
Yeah. Do you see... It's a big issue that's hard to know where to kind of start. And it also seems like we need change in people's hearts. And then we also need change kind of in our political structure or governmental structure or institution at an institutional level. Are you seeing anything out there today that would give you some signs of hope kind of at a governmental or policy level? Or like, because this has happened before, in 2014 and 2015, there was a few deaths, and then so 5 years goes by and then it's happening again. I mean, are you seeing anything at a level of policy that would give some indication for hope?
A wise man once told me that no law has any power to make anyone obey it. And the only reason people obey laws is because they have a reason outside of the law to obey that law. So, you don't speed because you don't want to get in a wreck. You're afraid of getting caught. You pay your mortgage and don't break a contract because you don't want to lose your house or get sued. But we've instituted a fair number of laws in this country to deal with the issue of our bloody racial history. And here we are still in 2020. And I think it's proof that a law can't change a heart. The best it can do is maybe restrain somebody's action. I want to have hope that there will be change on the policy level, on the federal, state, and local level. I think the things that I've seen out there are, proposals to examine policing on a city by city and police force by police force basis, taking a look at, everything from drug laws to cash bail laws to all sorts of things that disproportionately impact minorities, African Americans in particular. And I think that you could do other things. I've seen proposals for the creation of a separate unit in the U.S. Department of Justice to investigate potential police brutality or police misconduct or police departments that are corrupt, and give a big budget to those people and put the best lawyers and investigators in the country on it.
Wow. At what level again would that be?
Federal government.
Whoa.
So,
well, that would be a big deal, wouldn't it? I mean, that's...
but what's interesting is we already have some of those things. We have a Office of Civil Rights in the Justice Department that can investigate police brutality cases or, racial profiling cases or hate crimes. And I don't know that, I guess what comes to mind is the sentiment that was expressed by the folks at the Charlottesville rally several years ago. Does that tell us that much has changed since 1960?
What was that?
So the rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where there were the white nationalist protesters claiming, you will not replace us, Jews will not replace us, carrying tiki torches, very reminiscent of Klan rallies of years past. And that's where a woman was hit by a car and killed when she was out going to work. So it got a lot of news stories, and there was a lot of, we don't have to get into it, but there was a lot of, wishy-washy statements by the presidential administration that there were good people on all sides.
I remember that now. Yeah.
Thinking about that type of scenario, you have to think that, maybe people as a whole haven't changed quite as much as we thought they had. So I'm hopeful there are some things that can be done, and the real power that we have in our country is to vote. And I've seen a lot of great videos circulating where people say if your DA won't prosecute dirty cops, then get yourself a new DA. And then you have to examine above that level whether disenfranchised populations or segments of the population actually are able to vote in a new DA. We could talk about all sorts of things like redistricting and gerrymandering that pack people into certain districts so they don't really have the ability to elect representatives and public officials that will, do their will. It's a big problem. And so, it's just almost impossible to have a conversation these days about anything,
Right.
because we've all kind of adopted our political ideology as our ethnic identity.
Oh, man. Well, we absolutely have. Everything is so politicized. Like, we can't have a conversation about how to help the homeless man living up here under the bridge without that turning political in the first 3 minutes. It's like that with everything now. Everything's so politically charged. Issues of race, politically charged. Thoughts on how to handle the virus, politically charged. It's all so political. I mean, how is this going to go? Like, how... I mean, isn't that concerning? Because we're on a path here where everything's gonna be so divisive. There's gonna be these two parties, and you got to pick a side, and that's already crept into the church. I mean, you just have this, I guess, this unfortunate stigma of like evangelical Christianity with the right side, and yet then a lot of evangelical Christians are embarrassed about what they're doing. But everything's so divisive. How's this going to work out?
Well, you need somebody smarter than me to tell you how it's going to work out. I think that, the thing that I guess where I get the most aggravated when it comes to this whole conversation is thinking about how Christians in the church are involved in this conversation. And here's what I mean. If you're going to pick an idol, the most abusive's got to be the idol of politics.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems that people are more and more meshing idolatry of politics with their Christianity. And, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the Green Party, the Constitutionalist Party, what have you, it's not going to get on the cross and die for your sins.
Mm-hmm.
And, it can feel like your political choices weigh heavier than your spiritual ones sometimes, but they don't. And what's most concerning to me is that when you adopt a political worldview to be more important than even being a brother or sister in Christ, why would you talk to somebody that disagrees with you politically?
Right.
There's really far less distinction between me and someone on the other side of the world with a completely different ideology who is a believer than there is between me and a non-believer.
Yes. Yeah, totally.
And so the conversation gets real tense real quick. But I think that the only way forward is to recognize that the differences politically among Christians are so secondary to the primary things of being a Christian. And really, I think all our categories are wrong about politics. It's often said, I'm too conservative for, liberals, and I'm too liberal for conservatives. I'm a Christian. And I really think that that's even a misnomer because it kind of puts you as I'm a moderate. And
okay.
and you know who was who wasn't a moderate is Jesus.
Yeah.
What did he tell Zacchaeus to do? What did he tell the rich young ruler to do?
Yeah.
Give everything you own away to the poor. That seems even more progressive than the most progressive people who still, they may want higher taxes, but they want to keep some of their money. Jesus is saying, it's all mine.
Yeah.
And I think that is extreme for anyone. But for Jesus, it's just basic Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right about that. What is it about the political landscape that makes it such a temptation, or it's so easy for it to turn into an idol? Because you're right. People have the desire to express, it seems, their thoughts quicker and express them more strongly as it relates to kind of anything political than theological or even, getting into like just basic Christian, basic gospel principles. So there's something about it that makes it so tempting to make it an idol. What is that?
I'm not sure. I mean, part of me thinks maybe it's the control factor is, you can kind of control your life a little more. If you adopt a political ideology and you elect certain people that are going to implement things that you like to make your life look a certain way, and you perpetuate that. And so I think you could look in the United States. I mean, people say, well, let's go back to the grand old 1950s. Well, maybe so. That was great for middle-class white people. It was pretty terrible for most African Americans.
Yeah.
And so, why not if you're in the ruling class with all the power, why not perpetuate that? And so that, in a sense, becomes more important than almost everything else. But, I think that's part of it. I think, people, I don't know. I mean, people prefer other people that look and think and believe like them. And if you can pass a law that kind of mandates the way that you like the world, why not go that way? I there's been for years, I think, well, especially since September 11th, there's been a huge outcry of, maybe there's, that Islam is creeping in the United States. And, you saw reports of, or people claiming we're going to be under Sharia law or something like that. So we have to, we need to use the law to kind of mandate Christian principles and Judeo-Christian values. And, what I say to that is, well, first of all, that's not what the law says. But second of all, what if 100 years from now, our country is 85% Muslim and they pass a law saying you have to do what they want you to do? Wouldn't we be saying completely the opposite, is that you can't pass a law to do what you want me to do? And so I think that we just need to be cognizant of that. The decisions are difficult. The law is an imperfect vehicle. It was been said that, I forget which founding father said that, our system of government is the worst form of government except for all the others, right?
Yes.
So it's a difficult analysis, right? Because, you have to allow other people to express their religion the same way that you do. But the benefit that you get is that if you find yourself not in the majority anymore, you're not going to be worried that your rights are going to be taken away from you. And I think that if you're in the majority, it's hard to see things from that perspective, which I think is going back to just mercy. When you see things from the other perspective, it makes it a little clearer.
Yes. You mentioned redistricting. I've heard of this, don't know a ton about it. What is that?
So, redistricting is the process by which usually they're talking about United States representative districts. So who's going to be in District 1, District 2, and in many ways that determines who gets elected for that particular representative seat.
Okay, dumb it down real much for me. So are the districts within counties?
No, the districts are within states. So, and it actually, you have the same number of districts as you have electoral votes in the presidential election. So let's just say you're in a state with 10 representative districts. Every 10 years after the census, and the population is taken, and everybody submits their information, and they find out how many people live in different parts of your state. There will be a redistricting process in an effort to make all the different districts of equal population size, so that because we have a policy in our country of what's called one person, one vote, which means that my vote should carry just as much weight as somebody from Knoxville as somebody from Memphis. And so you try to create districts with as close to the same number of people as possible. But because people move, and people change over a 10-year period after the census, when you know where people are living, those districts move around. You change those borders. So you may be, let's say you live kind of on the edge of District 1 in State X. In 2021, after they do the census this year, maybe they move those district lines to make the districts a little more fair, and now you're in District 2.
Okay.
And so that changes your representative, right? So when I talk about redistricting, and specifically when people talk about gerrymandering, it's probably the term that's used more often. It's an effort so the people that draw those maps are state legislatures. So the Tennessee General Assembly decides the map for our United States representative seats. Okay. And what is alleged to have had to happen, and it's been proven to have happened in court cases, is that sometimes legislators will get together and they'll draw a map that tries to cram as many people of the other political party into as few districts as possible so that their party has more districts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you don't...
Because the more districts, the more representation?
That's right. And so
Okay.
It's called cracking and packing. So you crack up districts and you pack other districts. So you try to, let's say, that let's just say people who like a certain type of food maybe are not going to vote your way. So if everybody lives in this neighborhood and eats this type of food, you may put them in this other district. What's illegal in this country is racial gerrymandering. You can't put African Americans or Latinos or Asian Americans in one district just because they're African American or Latino or Asian American. But there is nothing illegal at this point about doing that based on political party. So if you know that people vote for the other party, you can try to pack them in as few districts as possible. And they're very complicated computer algorithms that do this and draw these maps. And recently there was I want to say last year, the year before, there was a big case in front of the Supreme Court called Gill versus Whitford. You can go and look it up if you want to. And this was a case that tried to get the Supreme Court to say that not only racial gerrymandering, but political gerrymandering is unconstitutional. It violates equal representation. And so, and the court actually declined to take that up and said, we don't have a workable standard. And the court was worried about getting in the business of deciding who was winning an election, and they didn't want to do that. And racial gerrymandering is pretty easy. You point back to the post-Civil War amendments to the Constitution. You cannot discriminate on the basis of race. So if you're creating, one African American, representation district in a state, you can't do that.
Okay, yeah.
But the problem is that you can do it on the basis of political party all day long. And so let's say your party or let's say the other party than yours controls your state legislature. You can pretty much guarantee that they're going to do everything that they can to either increase or keep their representative majority in your state. So that's what, there are many people who are much more eloquent in explaining it, but that is the rudimentary.
I think you're doing a pretty good job. It's becoming clear very quickly. I didn't know much about this. If you look at Tennessee, for example, how many districts do we have in Tennessee?
Have to look. I'm going to look it up.
Okay.
I want to say it's maybe 11.
Okay. And this has nothing to do with county lines like you mentioned. How, and I'm assuming that there's some amount of leeway, like you're not going to have the districts have the exact amount of people, so there's some amount of leeway. Is that something that gets fudged too at times? Sort of crossing over making your kind of pushing the lines on the size of your districts and having the size, or does that not matter at all? It just matters.
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
There's, for example, let's just take West Texas, for example, sparsely populated. It's gigantic. I mean, it's a huge land area, and you can look at the city of Houston. You might have a tiny land area, but because it's population based. So get my numbers right. There are 9 United States House representatives. So there's 9 districts in the state of Tennessee.
Okay.
And it looks like all but 2 are held by Republicans.
Okay. So probably the 2 that aren't are probably Nashville.
And Memphis.
1 in Nashville and 1 in Memphis, you think?
Yes.
Okay.
And, and part of that absolutely is a reflection that I think the majority of the voters in Tennessee tend to be Republican, right? So that's, this is not saying that because it's 7-2, there's something inherently wrong with our maps, because there are many more Republicans in the state. Just look at the polling from 2016. There are many more people that voted in the Republican Party than voted in the Democratic Party. Where it becomes a real issue is where the numbers actually may bear out differently. So, and again, I'm not an expert on Tennessee legislative maps, so I'm not an expert here, but the example would be, let's say it's 7-2 like it is here, but if you really look at the numbers, if you broke it down evenly by population, it should be something like 6-3, right? Then you worry, is there one seat that was maybe finagled with, for lack of a better word, an effort to keep a 7-2 majority? Okay. Because every vote in the House of Representatives can count in a contentious vote. Okay.
So you have 9 districts in Tennessee. Each district gets a representative.
Right.
And those representatives sit in D.C. somewhere?
Yes.
Okay.
435 representatives across the country.
So the representatives of the districts comprise the House of Representatives?
Right. And then you've got the Senate.
It's been a while since I've learned
since high school civics. And then
it actually kind of makes sense.
And then you've got 100 senators, 2 per state.
Yeah.
And D.C. gets no representatives.
Okay, so these districts each have a representative, and so presumably Tennessee has 7 Republican representatives in the House of Representatives.
That's
and
right.
2 Democratic.
And 2 Republican senators.
2 Republican, 2 Democratic, and 7. Oh, and then the 2 senators are
both
Republican. Sure.
right.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so how does moving the districts around affect the people in the district?
So it very likely affects very few people, but it could, on the margins, it could move people from one district to another district.
Okay.
And let's say, for example, a lot of people come into the state of Tennessee and they say leave the state of Kentucky. Tennessee may end up in 2021 with 10 instead of 9. And maybe another state will end up with 9, right? Or end up with 8 or lose 1 because there are only so many House seats and they get redistributed based on where people move.
Oh, wow.
Which is why you have a scenario where, say, the state of North Dakota has 1 representative, even though they still have 2 senators. And the state of California has dozens of representatives, and they still only get 2 senators because California became much more heavily populated. If you look at old electoral maps, like, for example, when Ronald Reagan won the presidency, California was Republican, and it had far fewer electoral votes. Florida had far fewer electoral votes. And now you look at the map, and the 3 or 4 biggest states the 3 biggest states are California, Texas, and Florida. So, and that was not necessarily the case 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So the number gets changed around.
I see. Interesting. Does when they do redistricting, does that affect where you go to school if you go to a public school or no?
No.
That's something different.
That's totally decided by the state. And actually in Tennessee, for example, it's each county has its own kind of school administration, and they set school districts.
Okay. All right. So what you'd want to do if your party happens to have, and the people that get to decide this redistricting, it's just whatever the majority of your representatives are, right? So obviously the Republican Party is going to get to redistrict Tennessee because there's 7 versus 2.
So yes, but wrong analysis. So the Republicans get to decide, but it's because they control the state legislature. So the state legislature decides the federal representatives. So our Tennessee General Assembly also has a House and a Senate, and they decide what the representation is going to be in the United States Congress.
Yeah.
Some states have actually bipartisan or nonpartisan redistricting commissions. And so they'll actually have an independent group that actually will create the map. And some states, like I know the state of Florida, the legislature do it. It can be challenged in court. And if nobody can get a good map, the Florida Supreme Court will actually come up with its own map. Every state does it a little bit differently.
Interesting.
And so actually one of the big reforms being proposed in this area, and I don't know offhand which states have nonpartisan or bipartisan redistricting commissions, is that's really the way to go. Is that, if you have people that are in power, their party's in power, there's a lot of incentive to stay in power, even if you really don't have the majority of the population with you on your side. And that's that's the criticism of gerrymandering, is that let's say you have 55% of the seats in your state, but you only have 45% of the state as registered in your party, right? That seems a little bit odd. And so one of the only explanation maybe could be that there's been some gerrymandering of the districts. And in a one person, one vote world, or, in a world where we want equal voting power among everyone, that's the criticism. And the retort from the other side is essentially, well, we're in power. We have the majority of the seats. We're not discriminating against anybody based on their race. This is just because we're taking a political advantage. That's nothing wrong with that. That's what it means to be in the political game. Convince more people to vote the other way, and then you can redistrict the way you want. And so you've actually had cases where the U.S. Supreme Court has actually dealt with redistricted maps where you've had Democrats gerrymandering and you've also had Republicans gerrymandering. No side is immune from this. I mean, I've been talking about Tennessee, which is a Republican state, but I think Maryland had this issue too. So it's not that uncommon. And the real problem from my perspective is that because so much of if you step back a little bit, and this is not what the state of the law is, this is Travis Brown's view of the world, but because so much of our voting blocks in terms of our parties tend to fall on racial lines sometimes, it can almost feel like political gerrymandering can feel a bit like racial gerrymandering.
Right.
African Americans tend to vote Democrat, Caucasians tend to vote Republican. It's just general, this is just that's not true of everyone. This is just kind of a generalism. And so it can almost feel like it's some form of racial gerrymandering, even if it's, billed as just political gerrymandering.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So what is the connection then between these districts with their representatives and then the electoral votes?
So we may need a whole nother hour. So the electoral college, right? The only connection is then the number of votes, right? So in addition to your House districts changing every 10 years with the census, the number of electoral votes your state has also changes. And just as a reminder, the only time the Electoral College matters is for the U.S. presidential election. No other election follows that system.
Okay.
And so, for example, in the current state of the map, California has the most number of electoral votes, just like it also has the most number of U.S. House representatives, because it's the most populous state, right? Followed by Texas and then Florida as a close third. And then you've got New York and Illinois and the rest, and you can work your way down the list. I think Tennessee is by far in the bottom third of states as far as population goes. It's rising. It's got more than Rhode Island and North Dakota, and but you've got states like Ohio is very populated, Michigan, Minnesota, Pennsylvania.
More than Tennessee?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So and so that's the only real connection, right? And so the electors, which are members of the Electoral College, are decided in various ways. States can pick them however they want. You just can't have a U.S. House of Representatives member serving as an elector, too. It can't be someone that holds an office in the United States government.
Okay. So the House of Representatives is not, if you're a representative for a district in Tennessee, you're not part of the Electoral College.
No.
Okay, gotcha.
The Constitution says you can't be.
Okay, interesting. And then can you explain how when we do elect a president, part of it weighs on the Electoral College and part of it weighs on just the every vote, right?
Yeah, so it's a little complicated because your vote actually doesn't decide who the president is. The Electoral College vote decides who the president is. And every state does this a little bit differently. In particular, I think Nebraska and Maine are some exceptions. But in the main, most states have adopted laws that say, okay, electors, when people go out and vote on election day, whoever wins the majority of the vote, that's who you have to vote for in the Electoral College. They bind the elector's vote to what the people do, right? Okay. So in Tennessee, let's say the election is between, John and Jane Smith. John Smith gets 52% of the vote. Jane Smith gets 48% of the vote. State law says all of Tennessee's 9 electors vote for John Smith.
Okay.
Right.
Every state has that law?
No.
Oh, wow.
So for example, Maine and Nebraska, I know they actually divide, and so not every elector has to vote the same way, right? So it's a little bit different. It's been seen that, so as you saw in 2016, Donald Trump won not the majority of the population, but he won the Electoral College. And that's because he won a few key states that gave him enough electoral votes to prevail, primarily because Hillary Clinton won California, which has just a huge population, ton of electoral votes, but it wasn't enough, right? You need some of those other states. Because at the country's founding, it really was thought that we were going to be a nation of states, not a giant country. And so, it actually wasn't right. It wasn't until around the time of Lincoln that people started saying United States is versus are. People thought of really before the Civil War, especially, which is why the South probably had less of an issue seceding as they saw themselves as independent states. Robert E. Lee.
Texas sees himself a little bit now.
That's
more
right.
like that?
Yeah, I think so.
Interesting.
I think they would say that. If you're from Texas, you think you can secede
absolutely.
whenever you want.
Yeah.
But that's why Robert E. Lee was famed to have said that I can't fight against my home state of Virginia in the Civil War.
Why?
Because he saw himself more as a citizen of Virginia than a citizen of the United States. I think that's the sentiment.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not a Civil War scholar either, so Civil War scholars out there can be free to correct me. But, and so when the framers drafted the Constitution, if you back up a little earlier, the document that predated the Constitution was the Articles of Confederation, which was even more state-centric and less federal government-centric. But it really crumbled because the federal government had almost no ability to do anything. It, couldn't collect taxes. States had to voluntarily give money to the federal government, which of course they're not going to do. And so, it didn't really last.
Yep.
And so they had to come together and put something stronger in place. But for a variety of reasons, they opted for a more state-centric version. I think there's a lot of good history out there that shows a lot of that was driven by southern states that were really fearful of losing slavery. And they wanted to be able to decide what happens in their own state and not be subject to some, federal mandate. Mm-hmm. There was already a growing disconnect between the North and the South in that regard. And so, but the majority, kind of a lot of the power in the United States was in Virginia and South. And so you had to have these states on board. And so if you read back to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, there's these big back and forths about how the government should be set up. You can see, Alexander Hamilton on one side, a big proponent of a strong federal government that was take a lot away from the people. He was actually very fearful of mob rule and giving people too much, power in a democracy. And then on the other side, you had people like Thomas Jefferson that said, let states do what they want, kind of leave us alone. We're gonna govern ourselves. And it ended up being a kind of a mixture at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. But you have this very state-centric model, which is why the Electoral College is so important, because in a sense it gives states as a entity more voting power than, say, an individual. Because, and you see that play out, that the popular vote doesn't necessarily determine the election. It's the way that the different states vote as a whole, as a block.
But the votes still count because whatever the majority of the voters vote in that state, in the state of Tennessee anyway, that's going to dictate how those electoral votes are cast.
And it's like all or nothing. You don't divide it. You don't say, well, John won 55%, so he gets 55% of the electoral votes.
Right.
It's you get them all, which is an interesting thing because that's not how the country as a whole votes, which is why, if you can tip certain states in a certain way, you can win the Electoral College by a landslide, but you didn't win the popular vote.
Right. And it would also, because the states have different laws, you said Tennessee, whatever the majority of the voters are in Tennessee, would dictate all of the Electoral College votes, but other states like Maine might break it apart.
Right.
So now as you're scheming and strategizing, you can, like Tennessee is going to be low-hanging fruit, for example, because if you can just get the majority, you got all of them. Whereas Maine, you get the majority, you get some of the Electoral College. And so you're factoring that in. Man, being a campaign manager must be a complicated feat.
Yeah, I don't want that job.
Wow. That's amazing how complicated it is. Fluid almost, really, even with the redistricting.
Yeah, it was a really interesting model. There are actually a lot of calls to abolish the Electoral College. People think it's unfair. It's not based on the popular vote. We don't have to talk about the merits of that, but there are actually some states, interestingly, that have started this little compact with each other to say, we're going to change our electoral votes, and we're all just, whatever the nation as a whole votes for in the majority, we're going to go that way, even if our state didn't go that way. And there's actually this thinking that if you get enough states to buy into that, you can actually destroy the Electoral College system because you have enough states saying, I'm just going to go with the popular vote, all or nothing. And, so it doesn't have quite enough yet.
But they have to change their state laws to do that, right? Okay, so they have to get that worked through.
And most of the state laws are written in such a way that say they're not in effect unless enough states do it. So the law just lies dormant until enough states enact it.
So back to, you mentioned if you have a dirty cop or police chief or whatever, the DA is the one to handle that. Is that correct?
Yeah, so in most states, you have a county attorney or a district attorney or a state's attorney that handles the criminal cases in that, typically a county or a parish if you're in Louisiana.
Okay. Is that what they call their counties?
Yeah, it is.
Parishes?
Yes, my wife's from Louisiana, so
really?
Yeah.
Huh, that's fascinating. I never heard of that. All right, so the DA is the one who holds the I guess, is it the entire executive branch? Because the police will be part of the executive branch. Is that correct?
I mean, so every state, I think, does this a little bit differently, but I can talk about Tennessee, right? So Tennessee state government has an attorney general, right? That's who I work for. It's a state-level job. Mm-hmm. And then there are judicial districts in the state. We do it actually by district, not by county, because there's so many counties in our state. We'd have far too many DAs. But Davidson County, Nashville, is so big that it's its own district. It's the 20th Judicial District, and so it has its own district attorney.
Okay.
And then there's its own
Who is that right now?
I don't know.
Okay, that's fine.
I used to know that.
Yeah.
We don't interact with the DA very much.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, keep going with what you're saying there. So
So the DA will decide, for the most part, which state-level crimes are going to be prosecuted in Davidson County, Tennessee.
I see. Okay, so for the everyday citizen like myself, if they're looking to enact change, would the DA or whoever that position in their district, would that be the person that would be most relevant or practical to make sure that's the right person to enact change as it relates to police violence and some of those things?
Partially, but, the DA doesn't really supervise the police force. That can often fall under the mayor and the police chief, So
Okay.
I think that, every state and every district's a little different. So it's going to be not the same everywhere. But, but backing up your question is, yes, who you elect as your district attorney is very important. And this is the person that you're, electing to make judgment calls about who gets prosecuted for a crime and who doesn't.
I see.
You can actually, and I forget the gentleman's name, you can read up about the Philadelphia district attorney or whatever that county is, made a lot of waves because he proposed a lot of different criminal justice reforms, ruffled a lot of feathers. For example, he required his staff to put together a cost estimate for how much it would cost to incarcerate an individual over the entire sentence so they can get an adequate picture of the burden on the taxpayer in putting someone in jail versus finding an alternative way to deal with the crime, and stopping prosecutions of like low-level drug offenses and things like that. So I think it's really important. Police chiefs are not typically elected. Mayors are typically elected. So who your mayor is, and let's just back up for a second. Who your mayor and your DA, your county commission has way more of an impact on your day-to-day life than your president. Your president's very important. You should vote for the president. I mean, who decides which roads get built in your neighborhood and where your sidewalks are going to go and what crimes are going to be prosecuted and how much money is spent on your parks and what business licenses can be granted and who gets to build what where and what city ordinances are going to control and where your kids go to school and what district you're in. I mean, the president doesn't decide any of that.
Interesting.
Who decides, where the hospitals are going to operate and how many, doctors are going to be performing a certain task or how much money is going to be dedicated to XYZ or where's the next city park going to go or where's a playground for your kids going to go? I mean, those
How about taxes?
I mean, those are, come on, Kent. Every level of government wants your tax money.
Yeah.
Do
you got to go to the governor to get in on?
No, there are county and city taxes.
Yeah.
And then there are state taxes, and then there are federal taxes.
Well, good point. Okay. So yeah.
So you can, at all levels, some, for example, like an income tax is typically a state or a federal tax. The city couldn't really. I'm not aware of a city enacting like an income tax on people, but
I think New York does.
They do.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
They probably need the money. A lot of people there, but there's like property taxes are typically a county business. Sales taxes tend to be state and city. You have other like specialty taxes for. Like hotels or other like restaurants downtown and things like that to promote tourism and pay for tourism and repairing streets and dealing with crowd control or whatnot. So, but yeah, I mean, I think that my point is that we have a lot of focus on what a presidential candidate thinks about a certain topic. And in all likelihood, the president's not going to impact that area of your life very much. I mean, the president doesn't make any laws. The president doesn't decide any cases in court. I mean, so there's a lot of things the president can't do, doesn't do. The president of the United States is the most powerful person in the world by default, but that doesn't mean that he or she is necessarily the most important person in your day-to-day life.
Yeah. Who were the three you mentioned again? Because what stuck out to me is I don't think you mentioned the governor.
So the governor I think is really important. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has showed just how important governors are. Because under our system, really the way the framers thought of it is that governors would kind of be the most powerful executives.
Really?
Right. So there's a doctrine in the law called police power, which is not like cops. It means this. It's a term of art that means just the general power to protect the health, safety, and welfare of citizens in your state. The federal government doesn't have that power. The only powers the federal government has are the ones that are in the Constitution that are given to it. Now, the commerce power, which I'm sure you've probably heard about, has been expanded over time to basically anything that affects commerce, Congress can legislate, and so that's pretty broad. But they don't have this kind of inherent power to just protect people, or protect their residents, or take measures that they think are reasonable. The governor, a particular state government or a governor can do that, which is why you saw governors putting together all of these executive orders telling people you have to stay home, you can't go out and go to work, or you can't eat at these restaurants. I mean, the president really doesn't have the authority to do that. That really falls upon state governors who have this mandate to just protect the well-being of their citizens. So I think governors are really important. What I meant is, my larger point is that the more, I guess, the further away someone gets from your house, right?
Yeah, right.
The less impactful they can kind of be on what happens in your house.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Yeah, it's logical. Yeah.
But yet we often care much more about who the president is than who
you're right.
Metro Council member is.
Yeah. So did you mention a council member, mayor, and I think there was a third one. So
I think I said DA maybe.
Okay.
And then, there's like public defenders. We elect judges in Tennessee. All these things are really important.
Yeah.
And, how many people when they go to the voting booth know the difference between Judge A and Judge B for a juvenile judge position in Hamilton County, Tennessee? Probably not.
Yeah.
But those are the people that, whoever the juvenile court judge is, if your underage child is arrested and thrown in jail and charged with a crime, that judge is going to decide what happens to your kid.
Yeah.
That's really important.
Yeah.
The president's not deciding what happens to your kid.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's this whole kind of nationalization of our political cares. Is we think that the most important people are the ones that sit in D.C., and they're very important people. They set a lot of policy.
Yeah.
They just, passed a $3 trillion budget and sent a bunch of people paychecks. That's a lot of power.
And the feds decided that, right?
That's right.
Okay.
The state of Tennessee doesn't have a standing army. We have a National Guard. We have a militia, but we don't go to war with other countries. The federal government does that. But, the local government is really important, and people tend to focus less on it because maybe it's not as fun to talk about. But
sure. Yeah. No, it makes total sense. What are your thoughts on state versus federal? Do you like it the way it is? Do you wish it was more state? Do you wish it was more federal?
Hard to answer that question. Think back to 1965, 1966, after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were enacted. Many states refused to implement them. They refused to honor the Civil Rights Act. They refused to allow African Americans to vote, so that, the federal government had to send in the army to force people to do it. I mean, I'm from Alabama. I wasn't alive, but you can read stories about George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, refusing to allow an African American to enter the University of Alabama until, the federal government sent the army to force him to do it.
Wow.
So, it's hard to imagine that very racist and stubborn states in the South would have bent to the will of the people on the civil rights laws without the federal government. On the same token, though, a state government is typically going to be a little more in tune with what's happening in its own state than someone 1,000 miles away or 5,000 miles away. And so I think it can cut both ways. It's a difficult question, and that probably is, people that are looking to pin me down politically probably hate that answer. Because if you're maybe on the right, you say the states need to do more, and if you're on the left, you say the federal government needs to do more. And I think the answer is just, it's complicated and it's difficult. And we have, for better or worse, have morphed into a system where the federal government is by far superior. And just how the world operates.
Yeah.
And part of it is just the nature of international commerce and world relations. I mean, the governor of Nebraska is not engaged in foreign policy with the Shah of Iran, but the president is, or the Secretary of State is. And so, in many ways, the framers were thinking these would kind of be little mini countries here in the United States. These states would operate almost independently. It's just not the way the world ended up shaking out. And so, I think that to say we should just go and give all the power back to the states, I don't think that's feasible or reasonable.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm sure that anybody could go through and find things that states would be better at than the federal government. And my friends on the right tell me that that's absolutely the case, and we should all the time be looking for things to give back to the states from the federal government.
Yeah.
And if you read the Constitution, read the 10th Amendment, that's kind of what it says. But
Okay.
that if it's not done by the feds, it should really be left to the states.
And why is that drawn on the party lines? More right tends to go more state, and left tends to go more federal. Is that because the right tends just to be more about freedom, more freedom the better, or is there other things at play here with wanting the states to have more power?
That is a great question, and I haven't really thought that through very much. I think a lot of it kind of comes out of the, if you look at the people who have really pushed for a larger federal government, they've tended to be on the left, not always. I don't know. You need somebody smarter than me to tell you why that is.
Yeah, I was just curious.
I think that maybe there's a sentiment kind of like Thomas Jefferson, leave me alone and let me govern myself. And I think that the argument from the other side is, well, when we let that happen, then how long did it take us to get rid of slavery? And then we had Jim Crow and then everything else. And so, if you actually think back to Martin Luther King's assassination in Memphis, he was planning a march with the sanitation workers in Memphis, and that's right before that was when he was assassinated. But the city denied him a permit to do his march, and so he filed a lawsuit in federal court in Memphis, and the federal judge, entered an order that said you have to give him a permit to march. And so it's a really weird showdown between Memphis and the federal judge sitting in Memphis. And actually, if you want a really interesting story, one of the former attorneys general for Tennessee, a guy named Mike Cody, was actually one of Martin Luther King's lawyers in Memphis at the time that went to court with him and was with him the day that he died. Later became attorney general. He has a great story to tell.
Is he still living?
He's still living. He's a lawyer practicing in Memphis.
This guy's a lawyer practicing in Memphis, alive today, who was with
Dr. King the day he
Dr.
died.
King the day he died. When was that?
1960. I have to look it up, so I'm not right. So I'm not.
But
wrong.
the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Dang. That's what's so shocking to me is there are
1968.
1968. Well, this no, later. Yeah, this I was just the 68 rung a bell, but no, it was 87 that the Just Mercy, the movie we were talking about earlier when that happened. So 68. That's what's shocking to me is when you think we tend to think like, well, we're way past this. That was way in the past. It's distant history. We've moved so far beyond it now. We think like in 2020 we have so many things going for us, and we can do space travel. Like, well, we wouldn't be still dealing with racist type ideas in our systems and laws and institutions and those types of things. Well, here's a man that's still alive, still practicing law, who was with MLK when he died because he was a black guy. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy.
We haven't moved nearly as far as we like to tell ourselves that we have. I agree.
Yeah. How do you think the founding fathers got so much right, though? Because it's pretty impressive. There was not really a pattern for this. This was really the first democracy, like what we have was really the first one, right? And to your point, all right, so what was that quote? It could be better, but it's the best one we have or something?
Right, it's the worst form of government except for all the other ones.
Yeah, I mean, it's fairly impressive for them to have put together all these documents so many years ago and for it to still be working.
Yeah, first I just have to say that, and I want to talk about some of the brilliance, and they were brilliant men, but you have to back up and remember that they were deeply, deeply flawed. Most, if not all of them, owned slaves. The African Americans were counted as 3/5 of a person under the Constitution. They deferred the issue of deciding slavery so they could get the Constitution passed. It took a long time until we had to amend the Constitution in the 13th Amendment to say that slavery is not allowed in the United States of America. And so I want to be very clear that for all the things that they may have gotten right, they got a whole lot of things wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe one side or the other will argue, well, they did what they had to do to form a government. They did the best they could. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's not. I'm not going to opine on that. But I don't want to have a whitewashed history of our country for my kids.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to look at the fact that at the same time, a group of white, rich men were sitting in a room in Philadelphia deciding how to form a government. There were, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of black slaves in the South that were living in, an unimaginable reality. And in many ways, that labor paid for the country that we have.
Mm-hmm.
So just want to get that up front before I talk about their brilliance.
Yeah.
And they were very smart as far as, thinking through how to create a political reality that would stand the test of time. It was the first, democratic republic in the history of the world. There had been direct democracies before. If you looked at ancient Greece, everyone directly voted on everything. They didn't want that. They also didn't want a monarchy after they just fought to overthrow one. And there is this real sense, and you actually can tell this when you compare how Americans reacted to coronavirus orders versus how other countries did. I mean, we went kicking and screaming, right? And other countries just complied. And why is that? I think it goes back to our heritage of we are not going to let, and this is what I think the sentiment is we're not going to let some government tell me what to do. Right. And that's, I think, goes back to kind of the sentiment of the Declaration of Independence, which is we have gone to the king again and again and again, really, other than the beginning paragraph of the Declaration of Independence with its, flowery, beautiful language. The rest is like a list of grievances, like you're doing this and we told you not to. You won't let us do that. You install governors that rule over us. We get a trial without a trial without a jury, or, you appoint people to oversee us. You won't let our legislatures meet. You impose taxes without representation. You do all these things. And because of all that, we're forming our own country, King George. So we'll see you later. And so I think there's a little bit of that sentiment that exists in the psyche of America, which I think it's really healthy to question your government. I think it's incumbent upon everyone to question your government. That's why we vote. So what was it about the framers that kind of made it work? I think there's a couple of things I would point to. One is the Bill of Rights, and there was a big debate about that, about whether to include a bill or not. Some folks thought, we don't have to, everybody knows these rights, of course you have these rights. The other side said, if you don't put them in, who's going to know? And then other people said, well, if you put them in, are people going to think these are the only rights you have? And so there was this big debate, but you think about what those words have come to mean. The document is very short, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I mean, it's, a few pages. I mean, it's not this complex, you think about a law library with, the Constitution is about this big.
That's amazing.
Like, for example, that says you have the right to freedom of speech, or the freedom of the freedom of religion clauses, which is the right to express your religion, and that the government can't kind of force a religion on you. The right to bear arms, the right to peacefully assemble, the right to petition your government, all the different things, the right to a trial by jury, the right to be able to confront the witnesses against you in a criminal trial, no cruel and unusual punishments for crimes. You can't, there's things that say like no bills of attainder or other things like ex post facto laws. Those are basically like you can't, after I've done something, you can't then go pass a law that says it was illegal and arrest me for it, right? Like I have to have fair notice that something's illegal before you arrest me.
Yeah.
No double jeopardy, all those things like that. I mean, it's pretty smart and a lot of foresight to put that in. The other thing that I think was pretty smart, I think it's actually really being tested right now, is the doctrine of what's called separation of powers, which means you have three co-equal branches of government that do different things, and they pull at each other, and it's always kind of fighting, and it moves very, very slowly. That was on purpose.
Legislative, executive, judicial.
That's right.
Yep.
And so, just back to Civics 101, right? Legislators make the laws, the executive branch enforces the laws, judiciary decides who broke the laws and decide rights between people.
Was there precedent for that anywhere in the world? Because that does seem fairly smart.
So, a lot of our law comes from what's called the common law of England. So a lot of our court structure and things really follows the English system. But, the whole idea of separating powers like that is really pretty novel. In the UK, for instance, the prime minister really wields a lot of the power, but that's a person elected from the parliament. So it'd be like our House of Representatives and Senate electing the president, right? It's a different model. We have a separate executive that's separated from the legislative branch. So I think that those were some smart things that they did. And I think the whole idea of what's called federalism, which is you have states and you have a federal government, they work together, or they're supposed to complement each other and push and pull on each other. That's pretty novel too.
Yeah.
No other country really has that.
Yeah.
And so I think all those things were smart, and the whole design was to keep one person or entity from having too much power, because they saw power as corrupting.
Well, you see that model. I'm thinking of it there's other business situations or structures, but you could think of a franchise, for example. You have locally owned franchises, but then you still have the corporation that is going to make some decisions, and you're going to have to deal with that as your owner operator. I mean, you almost have that state federal type dynamic that seems to work. Where does the Attorney General office fit in here?
So, the Attorney General actually, I believe, goes back to the English common law. So there was such a position that existed in England. And then the position was created in the United States. All the states had an Attorney General, and it's essentially the lawyer for the people of that jurisdiction. So, and every state does it a little bit differently. Some attorneys general have more power than others and can do more things than others. But typically, in Tennessee, for example, the attorney general is both the chief lawyer for the government and also the chief law enforcement officer. So although he's not in charge of police forces or anything else, he is considered to be the top of the law enforcement chain, so to speak. So, for example, in Tennessee, the attorney general handles all appeals from criminal cases. So the attorney general's office doesn't do any direct criminal trials, maybe a few things here and there, but all the appeals are dealt with by the attorney general's office. The attorney general has the role of what's called protecting the public, so making sure that the public's not being defrauded, and that's kind of part of what my job is. But so it's this kind of ancient, it's actually probably a title that predates president and a lot of other things. But,
really? Attorney General? Mm-hmm. Interesting. Does every state have a top one and then others?
Every state has an attorney general, and then every state has the county level prosecutors that we were talking about. But in some states, the attorney general may supervise the district attorneys. That doesn't happen in Tennessee. So Tennessee, each DA is independently elected, and the attorney general is appointed by the Supreme Court. So they don't really overlap in that sense. In the federal system, there's also an attorney general. So there's an attorney general for the United States. And it's a kind of a different system. He's appointed by the president and serves at the pleasure of the president. In Tennessee, the attorney general is appointed by the Supreme Court and serves an 8-year term, and it's really separate from the governor. In other states, the governor does appoint the attorney general, or some states, the attorney general is elected by the people. It really kind of varies. But in the federal system, he's appointed by the president, or he or she, and they serve as long as the president wants them there. And then they're responsible for the Department of Justice and the FBI and the Bureau of Prisons and the, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau and the DEA and all sorts of other things. And so, and the Attorney General of the United States is kind of the chief law enforcement person.
I see. So there again, you sort of have this balance of power because some of these authorities, representatives you elect, but then others are appointed. Like the Attorney General, that's an appointed position.
Right. You elect the president, he appoints the Attorney General.
Yeah. It's a very complicated governmental setup that we have.
Yeah, I mean, it's all designed to not concentrate power too much.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we have a lot of concentration of power.
Yeah. Yeah, we do. What are your thoughts on if you can comment on what are your thoughts on how the government and the power in place now, Trump is handling everything that's being thrown at him. Quite a lot.
Yeah, I want to be careful, because I have a job working in the government, but I'll make some maybe broader comments about the office of the president. And there are so many people that are way smarter on this topic than me. You'll have to get them on your podcast next. But I think what I've been thinking about is a lot of the things that we expect the president to do or to not do really aren't laws that are written down anywhere. It's customs and norms that we have and how we expect people to behave. Because at the end of the day, the presidency is a pretty powerful office, and there's a lot of raw power there. And we have been fortunate to have presidents in the past who have exercised that power with a great, at least some with a great deal, others with lesser deal of humility.
Mm-hmm.
And that they have a job to do, they are accountable. And so I think that, the only thing I'll say, I guess, is that if some of those guardrails are taken away and some of that the personal kind of humility that people attach to the office goes away, it can be, I think, a little frightening for some. And the only thing that really tells a president what he has to do in the Constitution is the oath. And all it says is that they swear to faithfully execute the office of president and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God's not actually in the Constitution. It was added later. But, you don't have to swear on the Bible either, but that's been done since George Washington. So,
interesting.
But I guess you could swear on anything. I think most have sworn on the Bible, but it's just interesting. The framers really thought that taking an oath would actually mean a lot. And at the time, it really did. Taking an oath in 1789, taking a solemn oath in their eyes before God and the rest of the world meant that you are bound to this task and that you are supposed to give it everything that you have. I think there's, people care less about oaths now unless you're in court and you're worried about getting arrested for perjury or something. But we don't really take oaths anymore.
Right.
And so, what is there to bind a president to act in a certain way that you think is appropriate? Not much. They can really run the government the way that they want to. And so, and I don't know what the answer to any of that is.
Mm-hmm.
Reading a really good book actually called Unmaking the Presidency by a guy named Ben Wittes. I'd commend it to anyone that wants to read it. It's about this topic. It's just why it's on my mind. And it's less so a critique of the personality of a particular president, more just how has the office evolved over time.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that's something I've been thinking about. The other is that one of the roles of being president that has emerged, at least since World War II, maybe since the Civil War, has been someone being the moral leader or the compass of a nation. And I think people are finding it's hard when you have trouble kind of getting a guiding kind of sense from the president. Even when people vehemently disagreed with the president's policies in times of national crisis or tragedy, people tend to put things aside, political differences aside, and kind of say, we need some healing here. And, the one thing that comes to mind, because I, lived through it, was September 11th, right? I think George Bush's approval rating on September 15th, 2011 was like 90% or something. And it wasn't because everybody agreed with him. And there's been a lot of critiques of what happened after 9/11 that the president did, and we don't need to get into that. But when you have a president going to ground zero, putting up a bullhorn and saying, I can hear you, and, that does something to the American psyche, and people really can latch onto that, even those that were his fiercest opponents, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, I think that a lot of people probably thought he was a decent guy, even if they disagreed and thought he got a lot of things wrong, or he, didn't listen to the right people or whatever. I don't think there was ever any doubt about, his moral credibility. He wasn't like a morally bankrupt person. And so I think that when people think about Trump, I think that they struggle to maybe find, especially in times of crisis. In 2020, my goodness, has been a year of crisis.
Mm-hmm.
We need a moral leader of this country more than ever. I don't know if we've had a good one since Martin Luther King,
Mm.
I don't know. I don't think we have, but I can't help but think that we need somebody to be able to take up a mantle like that and be able to really speak to the nation. I don't know how you do that, though. You can't create that out of thin air.
Yeah. I think it's too a reflection on our priorities or our values too, because, you can have the sentiment too where it's like, well, if the president's going to help us run our business better, lower taxes, give us more freedoms, make tough calls that are beneficial for us, then, well, I don't really care what he's like, But if we follow that line of reasoning, that can lead to idols too, because we're saying we don't care about the welfare of other people as long as it's good for us, or we don't care about the morality of leaders as long as it's good for us. So that's pause for reflection there as well. But what do you think about the idea of kind of like liking a leader? We could talk about the president, liking a president's policies, but not liking him as a person. I hear that being talked about more. I think since Trump, maybe, because the delta maybe seems a little greater with him than some of the others, where you might like his policy, but let's be honest, he's not super humble. He's, we could go on there, but do you think it's okay to separate the policies from the person?
Yeah, it's a tough question. Really, really tough question, because I think you could flip it and say, if you just said, it matters more about the person than the policy, then you could accept certain policies that you vehemently disagree with because you may like the person. I personally, I think I tend to lean more towards it matters more who the person is than what the policies are for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think that in leading a country and the way that things have shaken out since World War II, the president, in a sense, leads the world. I think it matters very much about someone's character, because it's hard to really imagine that policies come from any place except someone's character. And while someone with poor character may espouse some of the policies that you like, they undoubtedly are espousing many that you don't. And so I think that that's one piece. Another piece is there are many aspects of being, let's just take the president, for example, of being the president that have little to do with a policy decision at the voting booth and more to do with the president's temperament and character. I mean, we just talked about it, but how do you respond after a national crisis like we're dealing with now? It really, no one campaigns on that. That's not part of your policy platform for tax change or, administrative change in the government.
Yep.
Nobody campaigns on that. I mean, I think maybe Joe Biden is kind of campaigning on that a little bit now of, kind of restoring virtue or something like that. It's kind of his mantra. But, that's typically not a policy position. The one thing that really keeps me awake at night is what about deciding when to launch the military into an attack? I think that's much more of an issue of character than a policy position. You have to have sound judgment. You have to be humble. You have to listen to people. We are one of the, we are a country that does not have by default, a military commander-in-chief. We have a civilian commander-in-chief. You actually can't even be the Secretary of Defense if you served in the military in the last 5 years unless Congress gives you special permission, because we want separation between those things. We don't want somebody necessarily with a military-focused mind making the most important military decisions, and that's for a bunch of different reasons. But I think if you're sitting in the Situation Room making a decision about the life and death of human beings in the armed forces, I think character matters a whole lot more than what your policy position was on marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And not that policies are not important. They are important. Mm-hmm. But I think that, it has to matter who you are as a person. And me personally, I'm willing to overlook some policy differences for someone that I believe to be maybe a God-fearing or a thinking, kind of really thoughtful, humble person. because a president cannot run a country by him or herself.
Right.
You have to have other people doing it.
Yep.
Some of our greatest presidents have been the least informed, but the most willing to accept advice from others. And so they make good decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a giant staff of people who spent their whole lives thinking about issues you've never thought of.
Yeah.
And if you walk in thinking, I know what I'm doing, I have all the best policy decisions, it just seems like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
I think that you could probably, on some things, you may be able to vote for someone that's not particularly nice because they're doing things that you think are good. But I mean, there has to be a line somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. What about, go ahead. Were you going to say something? I interrupt you.
I was going to apologize for rambling so much. I'm a typical lawyer. I can't stop talking.
By the way, do you get your day in court? Do you have a lot of that?
I argue in court a fair amount. Yeah.
Okay.
I really like it. I think I liken it to kind of being a doctor wanting to do surgery. Like if I was a doctor, I wouldn't want to be an internal medicine doc. I'd want to be in the operating room.
Okay. So is that how you view that? Because you're at least the third attorney in the last bit who's mentioned that. They love to go into court. That's one of the highlights of their role.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of think about what Brian Stevenson was doing. I mean, that's why people go to law school. That's why if you want to do what you do. I mean, there's a lot of great legal jobs out there that don't require going to court, and there's a lot of great lawyers that never set foot in a courtroom.
Yes.
But I think that it's what I enjoy the most.
Okay. How do you, I don't see a whole, in the movies anyway, most lawyers when they're arguing are not holding, kind of reading from a manuscript. Do you create a manuscript? Do you put bullet points down? Do you hold, something to refer to when you're talking? How do you go about preparing to make sure that you communicate what you must communicate in the best way? Because there's probably a lot on the line at sometimes on these cases.
I think my methods evolved over time as I've gotten more comfortable with talking in front of people. When I first started, I would definitely script out everything I would say, and I probably sounded like a robot.
And would you read it?
And I wouldn't read it, but I would have it there to kind of fall back on out of fear of getting up there and not knowing what to say or losing my train of thought. Over time, you learn to trust yourself. And we do a lot of moot courts, so we'll practice. We'll have some people from my office pretend to be the judge, and we'll kind of, go back and forth to give me some, to go in. So I'm not doing it cold the first time.
Okay.
And I never do as well in the moot court as I do in actual court. It always something about the adrenaline of getting in there. This is the real thing. And, none of my matters have been as high stakes as the ones that Brian Stevenson was handling. Obviously, that's as high stakes as it gets. But it is, I hope I've improved over time. Now I default to more of an outline model or even putting down a list of points I want to make sure to cover. So as I'm going or, the other side's arguing, I can go and reference my points. And because many times these things, they aren't scripted out. It's not like you're necessarily delivering a sermon, where you want to go.
Yes.
And for example, I had a matter last Tuesday and I showed up and it was there were a lot of different things going on in this hearing, and there were 3 other lawyers there besides me who we all had things to argue in this one case, and we didn't know how the judge wanted us to go, who was going to go first, you had to just know enough and know what points you wanted to cover. And I thought it was going to start a certain way, and it didn't go that way. And so I'm quickly on the fly revising what I want to say.
Yeah.
And it's been my experience that if you know your facts well enough and if you know the law well enough, you can usually just get up and start talking and make your points. It's where you don't know enough and you having to constantly reference that you kind of ramble or you're short on what you need to say.
Okay. So you put a lot of focus on just knowing the subject matter and then talking from there.
I mean, the best lawyers I know, when they talk, they don't need any notes because they're the expert in their field and they present themselves that way. And you gain the trust of the judge, you gain the trust of the jury because you're seen as the competent person in the room. And that's where you want to be.
What do you do to mitigate dipping into that fight or flight part of the brain when you get into the back and forth and the arguments and those types of things? Do you do anything to deliberately keep calm so that you can keep using the reason and logic part of your brain?
Gosh, I'm trying to think.
It seems easy to dip into this contentious sort of argumentative, and next thing you know, you're not thinking properly.
I guess I would say just go back to what the law says. It's never wrong to just go. I mean, that's the one thing about being a lawyer is you can, you're not just making it up as you go. you're basing it off of something. I mean, hopefully so. If you're making a halfway decent job at arguing, you're using a court case or a state law or a federal law, and you're using that as your basis. And so if you get in an argument, you go back and you say, look, no matter what the other side has said, this is what the law says, and this is what happened. And that's either a red herring or it's irrelevant or it's whatever it is. But, that their side says what they say, but this is what the law says. And, and also you just kind of, it's just its own world. You come to accept that everything is contested. That's the whole point of the legal system. I have my position. You have your position. We disagree. That's why we're in court. We're going to argue. We're going to disagree. If we agreed, why do we have to be here?
Yeah.
No one would be here if we all agreed on everything. We wouldn't need judges. Everyone would get along.
Yeah.
And so, but that doesn't happen. And so we have to go to court and we have to have a neutral third party decide what's going to happen. And also because law, it's not always clear. I mean, you have a judge that decided things one way in one case, and you think you're kind of like that case, but maybe you're not like that case. And so you don't know. And so you're fighting about whether you're the same as that case. And so I think lawyers, maybe it makes them bad people, I don't know. And I'd be one of them, is that you kind of just learn to accept that it's that way and you thrive on it because that's what you're trained to do.
Well, what I love about lawyers, one of the things, and I mean, I've not met a bad lawyer yet, so I'm taking other people's word for it that they're out there.
Met very many.
I assume that they're out there, but the ones that I've met and run in contact with, what I respect so much, what I enjoy so much about them is their objectivity. Very objective. Cut and dry, I mean, I'm
not sure my wife always appreciates that about me,
but like even arguing against a lawyer in court who they're basically a friend, you've known them for years and, you're probably not going out to dinner after that happens, but they're not your enemy. No. You're doing your job. You're defending the people or making your case as you're supposed to do, and they're doing what they're supposed to do. And you have a friendship over 20 years.
I mean, there are lawyers I've been on the other side from cases with that I'll go eat breakfast with or have a drink with, and he'll get up and say that, Mr. Brown is so wrong about this case that you can't even imagine how wrong he is about this case. And I'll get up and say, well, Your Honor, he is so wrong about this case. And here's all the reasons why.
I love that.
And you walk out and you shake hands, have a great weekend with your kids.
Yeah, there's something about that, man. It's
probably weird to the outside world.
Probably, but it's just so, I find it so interesting.
It's because at the end of the day, lawyers aren't arguing about their own issues. You're representing other people. Yeah. I'm sure that the clients on the other side are definitely not going to be friends with each other after this. But the lawyers, my uncle's an attorney, and he always says, if it's a hard case, it's not my facts and it's not my money. I didn't come up with the situation, and I'm not paying myself. Yeah. It's like I'm just going to do the best that I can.
Oh,
the same lawyer on the other side is thinking the same thing, and also you're depending on how big your legal community is, you're going to see these people for 30 years, and so at the end of you're going to need something from somebody. Yeah. My MO is I always give the benefit of the doubt to another lawyer unless, it's really, I've been pushed to the limit, and there are times that happens where, I'm sure some lawyers don't like me and, and my job is a little different where, when you're doing what I do, it's not always the same as being in private litigation, but very much, you'll run into circumstances where you miss a deadline or you need some extra time for something and you have a rapport, and generally lawyers are going to say, sure, no problem. You can get that to me next week. No big deal.
Okay.
Or why don't we go to the court and say we need a little more time for this because they know one day they're going to be in a bind and they're going to need something back. It's a little bit of a quid pro quo, but also it's just kind of a common courtesy.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
And the majority of lawyers function like that. I mean, not everybody does, but I think most lawyers are pretty decent like that.
Do you argue in front of a jury often?
So I've never done a jury trial.
Okay.
So most of my arguments have just been in front of the judge. Okay.
Now, if you're arguing in front of the judge, well, in every case, then it's going to come down to essentially selling the judge, right? I mean, he or she is making the call most of the time.
So usually it's over a legal issue. So you're trying to convince the judge the law says X or the law says Y.
How much of your argument is reflective of the judge's reception of what you're saying, their demeanor? Like, are you changing? I assume that you are, because you're communicating with the judge and stating your case and making your argument, where you're paying attention to how this is landing on the judge and responding accordingly.
You have to, because different judges want things presented in different ways. And so you kind of have to come at it the way that the judge wants. I mean, the most obvious place to see that is to listen to a U.S. Supreme Court argument and to watch. Those are some of the best lawyers in the country, right? And they get up and they argue in front of the Supreme Court every week. And, it's a very tough gig. It's one of the most difficult jobs to have. The questioning is obviously very tough. You got 9 of the smartest judges in the world sitting there asking you complex questions. Only the most difficult things get all the way up to the Supreme Court. And they will, the judges ask questions, and the best lawyers will say, Justice so-and-so, and tailor their answer to maybe what the judge has written in past cases, because sometimes they disagree with each other. And so you're kind of playing these different sides. You may have a judge appointed by a Republican that thinks a certain way about the law, and another judge appointed by a Democrat that thinks a certain way about the law. And a smart lawyer is not compromising their position, but explaining things in a way that's palatable to different types of voices. Mm-hmm. And it takes a good lawyer to do that. And there are some really good ones.
Do you research your judges? Do you just know them at this point?
There's a lot of judges, so I don't know all of them. But the ones that I'm before, you tend to get to know them pretty well. And I think it's really important. Whenever you go to law school, they say credibility with the judge is everything. And it's true, because there's a lot of judgment calls that a judge has to make. It may be how much time you get for something, or how many witnesses you get to depose before your case, or how many days you get for your trial. There's no law that says you have to do it a certain way. Maybe there is in a certain circumstance, but by and large, it's the judge's decision. And if you have a bad rapport with the judge, you can probably expect to not get much leeway to do what you need to do in your case.
I see.
And so I think it's, not necessarily researching everything about the judge, but just building a rapport, being prepared, knowing your arguments, being respectful. The biggest thing that I try to do is when a judge asks me a question, no matter what I'm going to say after that, I always try to say yes or no, Your Honor. I see a lot of lawyers that get up and they argue and they get asked a question and they just reiterate their points over again. And if I were a judge, I would imagine that would be infuriating, because I asked you a question. I would like an answer to my question. And so if I say, this case, Smith versus Jones, does it say X, Y, Z? And you say, well, blah, 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 instead of saying yes, Your Honor, or no, Your Honor, or I'm not sure, I'll need to check on that. And usually when people don't answer directly, it's because they don't know. And I think the better answer is to say, I don't know, but I can get the answer for you.
Totally. That point I have thought of before in another setting. I remember telling someone one time that when I ask for an answer, I get a story. And with a kind of a high D personality, that drives me nuts. Like, if I ask a question, I'd like to exactly what you do, the answer and then the backstory. But if you just jump in on the backstory all the time, it's just, I don't know. I can't categorize it in my mind.
And, maybe the backstory is really important, and it's almost more important than the judge's question, right? Maybe the judge doesn't quite understand the issue yet. You're trying to explain it. Mm-hmm. Think about judges. I mean, my goodness, they get a zillion issues thrown at them every day from all sorts of things. You could be dealing with Social Security at 8 a.m. and a criminal case at 9 a.m. and a contract dispute at 10 a.m. and a slip and fall at 1 p.m. and you're having to decide all these different issues all the time. And so judges are incredibly smart, but you have to explain things and kind of lead the judge where you want to go, not in a deceptive way, but in making sure that it's clear. A very wise judge at a training I went to one time said, please make it easy for me to do what you want me to do. If you want me to say, give you the authority to take this extra deposition, make it really easy for me to sign an order saying you can take an extra deposition. If you aren't clear and you make it hard for me, it's going to waste my time. I'm going to have to go back. It's going to take forever. And by the time I get to it, I'm not going to want to do it anymore.
Yeah.
So, make it easy for me and I'll make it easy for you.
Yeah.
And so the best lawyers, they're short, they're succinct, they get to the point, they explain it clearly, they kind of show themselves as the authority, and the judge understands the issue. What I see go poorly is people that get belligerent, or they try to, and this has happened to me before. I've had scenarios where I get frustrated. I'm not getting my point across. And, I've had judges say, hang on a second, like, calm down. We're all trying to do our best here. And then I realize I'm losing. Because, if they're having to tell me to calm down, that means I'm getting too worked up about an issue. And so, I've had after a hearing, a colleague of mine say, that was not your best hearing. You should probably tone it down next time because you feel strongly about your case.
Sure.
You want to do a good job. And if someone's not understanding what you're saying, you may understand it perfectly in your mind, but that doesn't mean you're communicating it perfectly, right? What's the old analogy? It's like it goes from your brain out your mouth into someone else's ears, then into their brain. How many chances are there to misunderstand that?
Yeah.
And especially when it's unclear, you're arguing about something that's unclear.
Yes.
And so the best lawyers are able to break through all the noise and be really concise.
Totally. We got to let you go soon, but can you talk us through your role?
At the AG's office?
Yeah. What's your role there? Yeah.
Yeah. So again,
and how long have you been in that role? Just give us a bit of a backstory.
About 5 years.
Okay.
So, and again, this is not legal advice, and this is not the state of Tennessee's position, but so I'm in the Consumer Protection Division of the Attorney General's office. And our job is to enforce a set of state and federal laws that protect the consuming public from unfair and deceptive trade practices. It's a pretty broad mandate, but basically any act or a practice that's done by a person or a business that affects commerce in the state of Tennessee, if it's deceptive to a consumer or if it's unfair toward a consumer, and those have very particular meanings in the law. So it's not just, you can't just make up whatever you want to be deceptive or unfair. It has a very specific meaning. But we can investigate violations of that law. We have the ability to the Attorney General has the ability to issue subpoenas to gather evidence and then bring enforcement cases. And they're not criminal cases, they're civil cases to get changes to those business practices, to get money back for consumers that were wronged, to get penalties paid to the state. And things like that. So that's what my job is. So I am part of a team, a really great team that takes in those cases. We receive complaints in from the public where there have been issues. We look through those. We have a whole team of about 7 or 8 people that just goes through those complaints and reviews them. And then we get referred cases, and then we can take those cases and investigate and bring cases if we need to.
So you're into law. You're also in the day-to-day of business, really. I mean, you got a lot kind of going. I mean, it sounds like a varied role.
It is. Every case is different. Every case has something different to bring to the table. You're constantly learning about a new industry or sector of the economy.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, that's fascinating. Let's wrap it up this way. Do you have thoughts for the church at large or people that are believers? How, I guess, just kind of maybe a thought you'd want to leave with them, knowing what you know about government and everything going on in this world. And, obviously you're a devout believer, and I'm just kind of curious if you were to leave something with our listeners related to everything going on in the world right now, what would come to mind?
I think I would say that no matter the state of the world and people's views on politics and policy and who's the president, who's not the president, who you wish was the president, that it is okay to be a failure, because that's all that you need to be in the eyes of Christ. Mm-hmm. That's what comes to my mind. If I've learned anything from being at Emmanuel Church, it's that all we have to bring to the table is our need. And that's all that Jesus wants from us. Mm-hmm. And when you think about that, the other stuff really seems less important. And I think in a world that's where everyone is trying to jump through as many hoops as they can to ascend the ladder of, wealth or fame or political power or comfort, or, how high can the fence be around my home to make my life more comfortable? I think Jesus is calling us closer. And I guess the other thing I would say is that we really could use a lot of folks that have gone all in with Jesus, that are willing to kind of throw themselves into the political world. I think often it can be seen as corrupting, or I'm going to lose my way, or you can't go into politics and come out a decent person on the other side. And you know what? I just don't think that's what the Bible says. I think the Lord says that He ordains the rulers and leaders that we have. And what better way to get in on that than to go for it yourself? Mm-hmm. Run for office. try to make a difference. Become a city council member. Become a judge. We shouldn't be afraid of those things. I think that, there's not a lot of discussion about how to engage in that world well as a Christian, but I think it's absolutely a necessity. And not to say that we somehow should legislate what the Bible says about life through the laws of our country, but I think that it's another opportunity to show the love of Jesus to a world that's desperate for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. We do need more devout Christians in politics.
Yeah, and not
the
for the
whole gamut.
Right, and not for the purpose of just, well, if I'm in politics, then I can use my pulpit to,
yes,
evangelize the world. But it's just, the gospel reaches every part of society.
Mm-hmm.
No one is immune. And there is something of the Lord for someone that would get in on that.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Travis, thanks so much for coming by today, man. This was a pleasure, honestly. This was just fantastic.
Yeah,
I learned a ton.
Me too. This has been great.
We could go for several more of these for sure because, you've got a real wealth of knowledge. But yeah, thank you again. Really
Absolutely.
appreciate it.
You bet.